So we're going to move into the last topic of the course, health and mortality. And of course, in an unfortunate way, the motivations are all around us. So I want to make sure I'm delicate and respectful in the way I phrase everything, but it's a time, to do some deep thinking and also some learning about salient things. And so the name of the game today is going to be health inequalities. That's where some thinking about COVID-19 got me ultimately, and you'll see where that comes in. And if you are so bold as to read the news, you may be already fully steeped in that, as I have been recently. So some announcements. Lab 11 is on our studio and it's due tomorrow before midnight. And then Lab 13 is actually a B courses quiz and it's due the following Friday before midnight. It's on a 30-minute timer, which I hope is enough time because it's a very wordy lab. I was a little concerned about that. DSP students, we can program your multiplier in there, so DSP folks will get their time multipliers. As a preview of how we're going to conduct the final exam, then it's a helpful training course, to see if we got it right and if the thing is doable. If the time limit was too constraining, please let us know. If other challenges arise with it, please let us know. We're going to be writing the final exam. The plan is, of course, to do that around about the time on Thursday. Let's see, what day is that in May when we're scheduled to do the final exam, the 14th after Triple R week. With flexibility, of course, to allow folks, especially who are overseas, not to be able to do it when they can. And so the nice thing about B courses quizzes, obviously, is that you can start it whenever you want, and you'll be on a timer then at that point. Any questions about the rest of the labs? Can this lab be dropped if it's one of our two lowest scores, or is it different since it's in a quiz? It's a lab, so it can be the same, subject to the same policy of dropping it. So if you can't do it, that's fine, and sure your two lowest scores can get you a get out of lab free card. We'd like you to take it to do it if you can, just to test to make sure that it all works. If you have taken quizzes on B courses before, maybe you're more confident than I am, since I've not programmed it on that particular platform. So it's up to you. Other questions? Will the final be automatically graded? Yes, it's going to be a multiple choice or true false kind of computer graded thing. So it'll look a lot like the questions that are in that B courses quiz. That's right. Other questions? Yes, the quiz. Okay, the quiz, the question is, will the quiz cover next week's lecture? And the answer is no, not really. It's self-contained. So that's part of the reason why it's way too wordy for a quiz. What we did is we took Lab 13 and just translated it into a B courses quiz. So you can complete it now if you want. You don't have to wait until next week. Other questions? Moving on. So we are looking at wrapping up 175 soon. We've got today, next Tuesday, and then Thursday after that, and that will be it. And then the final exam on B courses around about Thursday, the 14th, with flexibility. So again, as I think I mentioned last time, if there's a challenge that you face with your schedule, reach out to me, and I'm sure can figure out something. Okay, I wanted to just stick this slide in here because I had raised the alarm, as probably I maybe didn't need to, because I'm sure any of you who were wondering about being affected by this probably already knew full well about it. So the Trump administration refined its shotgun of a policy that had been announced on Twitter on Monday night. And what they're going to do is pause green cards for 2 months for now. And work visas appear to be okay. Student visas probably are also going to be okay. That would be my guess. And what appeared to have happened here, of course, one never knows for sure, but it sounds like industry was pretty angry with the administration about this policy shift, which of course was so perfunctory and terse. Nobody really knew what in the world was going to happen. So what Trump said was, again, it's salient for the topics of the last several weeks in 175. He rationalized the change. by saying that, well, the work visa folks are not free to work anywhere, and the green card folks are. And so his motivation, again, appealing to his political base, was to remove immigrant labor from positions of competition with domestic labor. It all seems a little bit silly, to put it mildly, right now, given what has been happening to the labor market. But that's his story, and he's sticking to it. At least fewer people will be impacted by this, which of course hasn't always been the case. Any comments or questions about that? Anybody? Many of you probably know more than I do about this. Okay, so moving on. So the last topic then in 175 is going to be health and mortality. We'll do micro and macro stuff, and there's no shortage of motivations here, obviously, with COVID-19. And the thing that it lays bare, which I'm honestly not sure has been as widely publicized maybe as it should be, I don't know, but it has really made clear the challenge of health disparities. And what we're really talking about there is racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. We're also talking about low education, low income people. And of course, many times those groups are overlapping, but not always. So we'll talk about some basic facts. I spent a good amount of time trying to dig out some of the facts with the best statistics that we have, which seem to be coming out of New York State. And hopefully I did a halfway decent job. Many unanswered questions and many perspectives on health inequalities. So here I'm kind of blending this, right? So this COVID-19, there's also, the general background of health inequalities, which then we're going to dive into with the Grossman model and the material from the Bhattacharya textbook, which I think is actually on the reader for next week. But having given you this introduction today and next time, I think you'll be more geared up to be able to kind of slog through that material. A question from Sarah: will I be talking about the effects of COVID-19 in health economics this summer? I'm sure we will be. Yeah, I've not started to prepare that class. That's the Econ 157, but I'll be teaching that in June. And I'm sure we will be talking about it there too. The things that I'm not as well versed on are the bottlenecks in the health delivery system, I think, which are kind of the, not the only, but one of the big reasons that people are concerned with, shelter in place sorts of things. A question from Nicole: since the quiz won't be covering the lecture, will it be on next week's reading? So I think you're asking about, again, the quiz, lab 13. Do you need to complete the reading before doing the lab, for example? And the answer is no. You can just dive into the lab. It's fairly self-explanatory. It, I think, references the Grossman model, but I don't think you need to have done the reading to complete the lab. Okay. So here are some learning objectives. I regret how there's 6 of them here, and I like to be a little bit more parsimonious than that. Number 1, there are really big inequalities in human health and mortality across socioeconomic status. And I think we've mentioned this in the class before, but it bears repeating. They're enormous, and we should be aware of them. You could think of it as racial and ethnic inequality. You could think of it as income inequality, or as educational inequality in health and mortality. All those perspectives are correct. It gets a lot dicier trying to figure out why exactly we're seeing what we're seeing. And so the challenge, I guess, is to be able to speak intelligently about it, to be aware of the problem, and be aware of efforts to try to understand the sources of these things, and the arrays of policies that might be helpful in some dimension, and whether they are helpful in stamping out inequalities altogether, I think is much not so well understood. So that's where we're headed. It's hard, not for me anyway, not to think about these sorts of things given what's happening right now. Income is a good measure of socioeconomic status, SES. Education is probably a better measure. It depends what you want to do with it. The nice thing about dollars of income is that it's effectively a continuous measure, and education is the sort of lumpy thing where you could look at years of education, for example, but you still don't get a real fine gradient across many groups. And so I think that's part of the reason why people often prefer income. But the challenge with income is that it is obviously reverse caused by health. The more income you have, it's because likely that you're working more. It's also possible that you just inherited all of your wealth and you're drawing income from it or something, but that creates this big problem with trying to understand policy. Income is reverse caused by health, and it's not a reason to sort of just forget all about it, but it's important to be aware of that. And that's part of the reason why education is probably a better measure, even though it too can also be reverse caused by health at young ages. Health insurance and health care are important, but many other factors are as well. Health inequalities is not just a story about the lack of universal health insurance. It also doesn't mean that the lack of universal health insurance isn't an important part of the human story, of the American story in the United States, for example. That's true for sure, but it is most definitely not the case that if we woke up tomorrow and everybody had Medicare for all, we would see no health inequalities. We still would, and I think we probably would even in the long run. That's the punchline here. Health insurance is important, but it's not the only thing. When we look at population level stuff, it's clear that knowledge and technology are important. And then for individuals, being able to process knowledge seems to be really important. And that's another motivation then for thinking about health inequalities in terms of levels of education. Policies that expand insurance or increase income seem unlikely to eliminate all health disparities. I think I touched on that earlier here. And finally, I think as economists, as students in Econ 175, Demography 175, we're thinking about how to harness markets to generate knowledge and to expand health while delivering affordable care and opportunity to everybody. Those are the objectives, the tools that we have, and trying to balance efficiency and trying to, say, develop new pharmaceuticals and things like that with some kind of notion of equality and also equity, the ability of anybody to actually be healthy, regardless of how much purchasing power they may have, regardless of where they were born or what color their skin is, things like that. So here is sort of a disclaimer slide about the Grossman model. So this, I promise you, is the last model in C175, which you'll probably all be happy to hear. In my humble opinion, it's most useful as a metaphor and for sort of setting the table for later discussions about what drives health inequalities. It's not as transparent as the Solo model, and the model itself probably won't be on the final exam because of that. When I look at the Grossman model, it's hard for me to figure out how to use it to explain a topic that I'm trying to think about. And if I can't do it, I'm not going to expect you to do it either. It's useful to start from this view and then see where it takes you and then discuss health inequalities in the context of all that. So by contrast, the Solo model probably will be on the final. The Grossman model probably won't be because it's useful, but it's not as parsimonious and clear and just easy to understand, I think. And if you're thinking to yourself, Professor Edwards, I think you're nuts. I don't understand the Solo model. Well, okay. Yeah, I promise you the Grossman model is more challenging than that. It looks more like something that you might see in graduate school than something that's appropriate for undergraduates. There are pieces of it, I think, that are familiar, but it's a hard thing, and we're not going to hold you to that standard. It's just not realistic. So before I start talking about the current events and the motivation, this is my warning. This is my my acknowledgement that this is tough stuff, and it's okay if you don't want to listen to this. COVID-19 has changed everybody's lives. It's crazy. If it has directly impacted you or your family, please accept my personal condolences and sympathies. Many students are heavily impacted, whether it's travel-wise, family, health, all that stuff. You won't see any final exam questions about COVID-19. We won't make them that specific. And I apologize if by mentioning it during class is upsetting. I get it. On the other hand, you might find looking at some of the science could be a way of distracting you from the much less pleasant parts of it. That's possible, but you can make your own decision. I do suggest that if you don't really like this part, skip ahead to, I think we're looking at slide like 20 or 25 or something like that. But I wanted to talk about the great motivation here. So if you started at like slide 25, I think, is that right? 23. Probably get you past all the yucky of COVID-19. All right, what is COVID-19 showing us? A lot of things. The gray points here are things I just happened to think of that came out of my head. Advanced planning, transparent communication, government accountability and flexibility, importance of quick responses by industry and government. I think we're going to learn a lot more about these sorts of things moving ahead. And, one of the things in my life, looking ahead to teaching health economics and understanding more of the industry side of healthcare and being healthy, one of the great questions I think that's going to emerge here is, what is the best structure of private industry and government, whether it's a public payer and a public insurer of healthcare, or what exactly? And there seem to be some early lessons that a decentralized approach may have really helped some of the smaller countries here. Now, China, of course, is a very large country, and I don't know whether a decentralized approach had been taken there or not. Certainly different parts of the government operate with some autonomy, I think. But what I'm referring to is a big part of the story appears to be that in Germany, the decentralization there in some level allowed local labs to react much more quickly and get testing done. That did not happen here. And exactly why is a real head scratcher. But it seems like a lot of bungling by the Center for Disease Control and other groups, and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that has to approve things, may have been part of the story. So I'm eagerly awaiting what we find out about that kind of thing, and it's really not obvious which way it's going to go in terms of the kind of classic free market economics story versus a structured public response where collective action and collective guidance might be better. It's not obvious. One might see, of course, a mixture of both of them. Challenges of globally connected economies and heterogeneity in social responses and outcomes, all these things. And then we're going to talk about these deep-seated, with us for a long time, inequalities in occupation and income and health behavior, health conditions and outcomes, and trust in medical advice and government. So that's what we're going to dive into. I need to take a deep breath and just I don't know, take a laugh break or something. I'm realizing that this. I think part of the reason this is so hard for me to write these slides yesterday is that this is serious stuff. Needless to say, we should not shy away from serious stuff. It's just that how to see the usefulness of looking at this right now. It really, I guess, is a clarion call for work in health inequalities. And I've been involved in that in some way or another for a while in my career. It's sort of a Freudian slip there. I've had, I guess, several different careers now, but you may find this as well, that the thinking about health inequality is your calling. Thinking about preparedness for pandemics might be something that really you want to be involved with, or something related to that. I think that's the objective, is to think about this in a helpful way, to guide policy and to guide smart people such as yourselves into thinking more about this and how we can improve things. And it begins on some level just with understanding what the nature of things really is. All right, so let's dive in. There's tons of complicated parts of this. The testing and the colossal failures there, it appears that South Korea and Germany had a leg up on everybody, especially in the United States, though cases of the coronavirus seem much less reliable than deaths. And so we're going to look at the patterns in mortality as best we can measure. In the US, this is a decentralized thing where state health departments are all reporting statistics, which is a good thing. But they're all in different formats, which is not so good. And New York State is a leader in quality statistics. It's also kind of ground zero for coronavirus mortality. Okay, so let's just take a step back too and look at the context here. That we're concerned, rightly so. We've already seen very heightened, elevated fatalities in New York City that I think remind us of all this. And we discussed back in class 4, which I think was after our own hospital stint because of our one-year-old child at that point had been in the hospital. So I was much in the mode of thinking about communicable diseases like this. So she had RSV, what that stands for, respiratory something. It's a classic stuff, right? Medicine has become so complicated, I can't remember what it is. She also got double pneumonia, I think. So I was thinking about this a bunch at the time. In 1918, and there's some suggestion that it started actually in 1917, perhaps, what was called the Spanish influenza swept across the world. It might have originated in the United States. It probably killed Donald Trump's paternal grandfather. and the death rate was high, 2.5% or more per the CDC. It was also the same subtype as the 2009 swine flu, which I remember much better. That was the year that we were given a timeshare for a week in Mexico, and my wife and I, we took it, and we were okay. And it turned out that the swine flu pandemic then, it killed people, but it was nowhere near on the same scale as what we're looking at either in 1918. So here's the story again with 1918 that we saw earlier. The upper line there in blue is the total all-cause mortality rate, the death rate per 100,000, and the bottom orange line is the share attributable just to pneumonia and influenza, which really peaked a ton. The story with the flu usually was that the flu itself would kick off this deadly acceleration into death from pneumonia. So a great big peak in this, and this is what we're all trying to avoid for sure. The thing about 1918 was that there was this unique W impact on death rates. So whereas usually the flu would kill you if you were very, very young back during this time, so the average of 1911 and 1917 is shown in this graph, showing a great big spike here with the very young kids. And of course, you know, this was certainly on our minds, bringing our little daughter into the ER, that, you know, the mortality rate isn't this high anymore, thank goodness, for any age group compared to what it was back then, because of course this was before the development of penicillin. The product amoxicillin was what I had when I had pneumonia, and also what was given to my baby daughter too, and it works, and it, you know, thank goodness for the development of antibiotics. Prior to that, there was this enormous spike here in working ages that really was unique, and it was just a terrible grim reaper. So we're going to look at what we can with mortality statistics out of New York State. So ideally what you'd like to do, the punchline is here in the title of the slide, is that it seems like COVID-19 is a V. So it still impacts young people, I guess. I probably shouldn't have even called it a V. It's more like an L, I guess, or a backwards L, whatever that is. I obviously should have thought more about calling it that, but on the previous slide, so this looks like a V if you think about what flu was before the Great War, and that was sort of the point, I guess, I tried to make. But you'll see that actually there's really no spike at infant ages, which if you're like me, you're like looking for any silver lining in the cloud here, and that's not a bad one. It certainly doesn't, you know, nullify the other horribleness that we're all living through with everything. So what you'd like to do is measure the mortality rate for people aged X to X plus N. And here I've left off the N's, but I guess the point is that there's some age range that you see deaths in. You also might see single years of death, but of age rather, in the death record. But the big challenge is that, you know, the counties and the states are not used to releasing data that could theoretically be individually identifiable. So the format of this stuff is challenging. And I had to combine multiple sources to try to come up with actual mortality rates, which I was able to do late last night. Instead, I also looked at this, which is going to give you something that's interesting, but it's problematic. If you look at the share of total deaths, and I'm calling it little SX, this is not on the exam, you don't know this. This part you probably should know, right? It's the deaths per population is the mortality rate. Here's my other measure. Well, suppose all you have is the deaths. And so what you do is you sum the deaths across all the ages X, and then you look at the share in a particular age group over the total number of deaths. And so that could be revealing if the underlying age structure is unchanging or not different across groups. Then it's sort of okay to do this. But if the age structure is different, then you're going to run into problems with this. And of course, ultimately, what we're going to do is do things like look at the mortality rate for African Americans versus white Americans. And there, the age structures are quite different. So you want to look at the mortality rate, which corrects for the age structure. This thing that's just a piece of trash that I came up with is not going to do it. So I included both because I was rushing to get this done. So here are my data sources. Here's the COVID tracker for the state of New York, which is amazing stuff that they have put together. I mean, God bless New York State for actually doing this, because you know, it's a touchy subject. There's privacy issues and sensitivity involved, but just getting information out about this is just so incredibly important for guiding policy and also for our understanding. For the populations by age, sex, race, and ethnicity, what I did was look at IPMS, which is actually the American Community Survey, the 5-year pooled data set. So it's not quite the right time period, but it gets us close. All right, I regret even showing you this, but it because it just raises a bunch of questions. Here's what you get if you look at my bad measure of percent of deaths among a group by age. And so the red triangles is what happened in 2017, where we have the most recent full year of data available. And the blue dots are what has happened so far with COVID alone. And the problem is, I think your eye is drawn to this upper point up here, which is lower than the red curve, because there are fewer 90-plus-year-olds in the population, and that's why deaths among them are a small share of total deaths. So in this not great measure that I came up with, this is smaller. Is it smaller because 90-year-olds are less likely to die from COVID-19? I suppose that might be somewhat true, but it's more the case that there just are so few 90-plus-year-olds relative to everybody else. So the big bulge here is like the 80 to 90-year-olds here. That's a big age group. That's the the Vietnam War, or the old folks who served in the Vietnam War and spouses. Those are quite plentiful, and that's why this thing gets so small. As 90-year-olds just kind of vanish at that point. There are different age groups here then in the statistics on deaths from 2017. And I tried to fix that here, I think, in the next graph. We see something similar that I think lays clear what I'm trying to say. So the COVID-19 mortality rates are higher here, maybe not as high, I guess, if we did look at this out measure here at age 90. It kind of depends. So here's the statistic for 2017. The total deaths there, the mortality rate gives us something like this. I plotted them on two different y-axes, so the levels of these things should not be viewed as comparable. The point is the shape of it, and what has been happening here. I should probably go back and redo all this, but my punchline was that it looks like what COVID is doing is shifting mortality earlier in the age range. So that's what comes through in this graph. That's what I hope is sort of coming through over here as well, that the blue dots are to the left of everything. Okay, so shifting mortality earlier. That's not great. It's maybe not as bad as the W, right? That we had the great big increase during the 1918 influenza epidemic that just laid waste to people of working age. What this seems to be doing is making mortality happen earlier for people who otherwise be living another 5 or 10 years or something like that. That's the way to think about it. It's accelerating it. Okay. So with shifting death earlier like that, if other things were equal, then groups that already suffered premature death would suffer more. And then on top of that, things aren't equal. Exposure to community spread COVID-19 is probably associated with occupation and industry, and disadvantaged race and ethnicity and education groups probably are more exposed in some ways. The other thing, of course, is that some of the most exposed people are actually in the medical sector, and they're not, I wouldn't say disadvantaged. They have high education. Some of these things will need to be worked out, but I guess when I think about it, people who work in grocery stores, people who have high contact with the public right now, tend to be folks further down the skill distribution. So other things are not equal. It's not as if everybody who's working in these exposed industries is sort of randomly selected out of the population. In fact, we're seeing some selection here based on background characteristics. A ton of other things, of course, place disadvantaged people at risk. Living in an urban environment where the population is denser, the number of people living per housing unit, political control of state government seems to be important. And in some states, if you like, the interests of the urban areas are aligned with the interests of the state politically, because that party is in power. In other places, I think it's not. And I think one of the examples that we see that rather starkly is in the state of Georgia, where Atlanta is heavily African American, but the state government is, I believe, run by Republicans, and so there's some tension there. All right. And I was scratching my head about exactly what this means, but so this is off the New York State site, pointing to inequalities in the COVID-19 impacts, basically. And again, I guess I think what's emerging is that if you have something like COVID-19 that is basically accelerating mortality for people, and it raises the question, well, why would you be dying of things? Well, the answer is you might be really sick with an underlying condition like diabetes, which could be managed. It could be a respiratory ailment or something, which can be managed. It could be asthma, chronic asthma, and all of these things we know, it turns out, impact people with less socioeconomic status more heavily than those with higher socioeconomic status. So I wish I knew for sure exactly what they were doing here on this slide, but roughly speaking, I think they're saying that in New York City, that's what this column means, 34% of the deaths are to Hispanic people, 28% of the deaths are to Black people, 27% are to white people. So the white deaths are 27% of the total number of deaths. And they're pointing out that that's a different share. So the whites, then their share of the deaths is smaller than their share of the population. And for Hispanics, and that's also, the reverse is true then. So the deaths are a higher share than compared to the population shares. That's a sign of racial and ethnic inequality and the impact of COVID-19. One of the big challenges here, though, is how a population share is what it is. But it turns out in the data, whites in New York City are much older on average than Blacks and Hispanics are in New York City. When you're older on average, you should have a higher share of the deaths. And I don't know for sure whether they're adjusting for age here or not. But the way I read it, it seemed like they weren't. And so then I cranked through it into a slide here to kind of have us have a look at this. And it looks to me like that makes the story even more shocking, even worse about the toll that COVID-19 appears to be extracting from minority communities in New York. So the first thing I did was to look at the percent of total deaths among a group across the age range. And this again is this measure that's going to be rather horrendously polluted by age structure here. So this is the curve for Black or African Americans here, which is the orange one, which shows a significantly higher share of total deaths for that group. Then it's about, say, 18% of deaths for that group occurred here at age 55 to 65, which is what that point is, compared to the equivalent for whites, which is a much smaller share of deaths for them, only maybe 10% or so. Part of the challenge, of course, here is that if you have a population that is differently aged, you would expect to see a rather large difference in this. So the next thing you might want to do is actually look at the mortality rate, which will correct for that. And this is then the story, I'm sorry, I should have said both of these are the story for New York in 2017. I think I said that in the previous title here. Here's the log mortality rate for these three different racial ethnic groups. And the other challenge is that they're not technically mutually exclusive, even though one would like them to be. So some of the people who are identified as white, I think, are also showing up as Hispanic here because of the way New York measures it. And that's a little bit challenging. So part of the similarity, I think, which is a little bit shocking here, that whites and Hispanics actually have a rather interesting relationship in terms of their mortality rates. And this is the way you'd want to measure it. This is what I came up with late at night, last night when I was writing the slides. So African Americans in New York State, however, have a much higher rate of mortality at each of these ages up until the very last one. And so maybe they've got the same rate here at the penultimate point, which would be, I think, ages 75 through 84. And then at the last one, they're actually lower in terms of mortality rates, but the African Americans are dying at higher rates at these sort of prime working ages, if you like, all through here and then up here. And of course, this is total mortality. So part of this is what's called external mortality, deaths due to violence, whether it's homicide or suicides. That's part of it. There are deaths also due to substance abuse and things like that. Here's a question: do they not distinguish between white and non-Hispanic white? It's a really good question, and I think in the data I saw, they did not. There are two different questions on these sorts of surveys that would be in the population. So it's what's your race, and then you're either white, black, or you could say other things as well. And then they'll ask what's your ethnicity. So if you fill out the census form for Census 2020, it's the same story. The Hispanic question is a separate one. And so what, as the investigator, what you have to do is take the data and sort of cross it, right? So you have to be white, say non-Hispanic, that's usually one group, and then black non-Hispanic is usually another group. And then usually people take everybody who says they're Hispanic and puts them all together in one category, viewing that as kind of a distinct group. So that's usually the way it's measured: white non-Hispanic, black non-Hispanic, and then Hispanic of any sort of race background you can imagine. So there are Haitians, many of whom have very dark skin, who would probably call themselves black. You also would have Cubans. They're probably identify as Hispanic, but most of them, it's very mixed in Cuba, but a lot of folks have light skin. And so that, you know, that's kind of the usual thing. And the problem here is that you can, I think, measure it separately also on a death certificate, but I think New York had decided we're not going to do that. We're just going to do it, okay, white or black or other race. And here's also the data for Hispanics. And so then you can't cross it. And so you can't, you know, separate. And so it would be best to do so. But I think ultimately the story that pops out is kind of the same. You can tell I find this, yeah, that kind of identity stuff is really interesting. And if you want to write a senior thesis on it or something, that would be cool. Okay, the punchline here. African Americans already before COVID-19 were facing significantly higher mortality all across the board here. African Americans die earlier. Part of it is external cause, but part of it is the chronic health conditions that we'll be talking about throughout the rest of today and then into next time. Things like the burden of diabetes, of high blood sugar that you have to regulate. It's become a lot easier than it used to be, but it still is, you know, kind of a pain to do it, and it disproportionately affects African Americans. It's also associated with diet, but not exclusively so. And so you might then say, well, there's sort of a diet issue here. Sure, there is. And you might say, well, there's an external cause mortality issue. There's violence. There's, you know, if you're African American and you get shot by the police, you know, you're in the statistic. That's true. But if you take out external cause mortality, you typically will still see the same pattern emerge. So does that mean that some people may be double counted? Yes. If you identify as both Hispanic and black, or Hispanic and white, you'll show up in two places, and that's right. And so if you do this professionally rather than quickly on the day before trying to get the slide together, you want to make the distinction typically. But if the data limit you, and again, this is just pointing out how magical it is that New York State actually has data and they've shared it. You know, bless their hearts for doing this, that we can actually take a peek and motivate this discussion about the inequalities here. You definitely would want to make them you know, non-overlapping groups. And here I think they are overlapping, which is not ideal. But before moving away, let me just say though, that one of the real shockers here should be that Hispanics in New York State have lower mortality than whites. And you might say, well, okay, then, you know, there are plenty of, you know, poor white people. That's true. And less educated white people, that's very true. But this is a kind of a magical finding. It's called the Hispanic health paradox. And it's somewhat associated with being foreign born. I don't think we spend a lot of time talking about this, but it turns out that immigrants usually have better health than non-immigrants. And that's partially what this is reflecting. The Hispanics and other immigrants in the New York City and New York State area have better health and they have lower mortality. And there are a variety of things to say about that, but you could view it as a healthy immigrant selection effect, that, you know, people are immigrants because they are healthy and able, and they migrate and they work and they're productive and they are healthy. Another thing is that, you know, part of it is the issue about, well, if you're an immigrant, where do you choose to die, right? So this is mortality. And you might think that, you know, returning home is what might happen. And studies that have tried to track this have found that, yes, that is important, but it doesn't remove this protective effect of being Hispanic. And the other thing that you might say is that, you know, Hispanics are different than non-Hispanics. Cultures are different. Diets are different. what you do for fun is different. And if you spend time in the out of doors and in the fresh air rather than in indoors might matter. I'm not saying anything in particular either way about who does and who doesn't do that. It's just that, all these things are important for health. Occupations are different, all sorts of things are different. So this is a remarkable finding, but it's true that Hispanics actually have lower mortality than non-Hispanic whites, or the same. It could be the same or lower. It kind of depends what study you look at. Okay, here are a couple of remarks in the comments that are, I think, very smart. And yes, you're right. I'll leave that and move on. Okay. So what I did was try to do, it could be that they were age adjusting on the New York State, in the New York State statistics there, but I guess I didn't think that they were. And so what I wanted to look at is the population shares in New York State. So they did it by New York City and New York State, excluding New York City, which is a little different, and it's reasonable. But here what I did is I had gotten all the data for New York State combined. And of course, what that's going to do is mix, very different types of people together that, rural New York State folks are just very different. And of course, on average, they're much more likely to be white, less likely to be Black or Hispanic. If you look at the shares of the New York State population, you see something like this. So the African-American share is actually pretty high compared to what you would see nationwide. It's more like 10%. It's also high in a state like Florida. It's not particularly high in California, where the Hispanic share is higher. But the share of all deaths in 2017 reflects the differences in age structure here in the state, where 80% of all deaths were of white people, compared with 14% were of all deaths were Blacks, which roughly matches their population shares. But underneath it all, I mean, if you don't age adjust, what is this really telling you? Well, it's telling you that white people are older. So of course, there are going to be more deaths there. If you do it this way, though, then you would expect, you basically see that, I mean, this is just a crazy, topsy-turvy world then, of the share of COVID-19 deaths that are across the entire state, taking what they did on the website, if I understood what they did and what they didn't do, a much imbalanced set of ratios here. Part of this is reflecting how many Blacks and Hispanics live in New York City, and that's the epicenter of COVID-19. So it's the difference between this row and this row that I think really is telling. In a normal time, you might see twice as many deaths as you're seeing in the COVID-19 share. Now, a couple of caveats that all deaths means all deaths, all causes, and so you might think, all right, I'd rather look at the deaths to pneumonia or the flu or something, and that's reasonable. And it might be different, but I really think that this is basically showing us a couple of things, that racial and ethnic minorities are much harder hit by this in New York, and also that racial and ethnic minorities are much more likely to live in New York City, which is harder hit because it's denser than the rest of New York State. And so this is my little emoji about, it gets worse if you do it my way. If I'm not, maybe they did it right on their website, which certainly gets the basic punchline right, I think. But I think it's even worse if you do it this way. It really lays bare just the kinds of inequalities that we're seeing today. So let me take a quick pause before I dive into the more broader story about health inequalities. The chart also shows the pre-existing conditions like diabetes makes you more vulnerable to COVID-19. And so it looks like Nicole is maybe looking at the New York State website with that link. And because I don't think I have those in the slides, but she's absolutely right. She's pointing out that there are measures of what are called comorbidities, or the pre-existing health conditions in addition to COVID-19 that you might show up at the hospital with. And that's right, that it appears, so a couple of things to say, that a lot of the folks who have died from COVID-19 had a lot of comorbidities or other pre-existing conditions, and they also usually had several of them rather than, say, just one. The story seems to be one in which, not across the board, but in many cases, it's the vulnerable people who have health that's already been deteriorated or been deprecated, decremented. I'm trying to think of a good word there, but they've already had some health shocks in their lives, whether it's growing up next to a freeway and so you develop asthma early on, or if it's developing type 2 or adult onset diabetes because of a variety of things, genetic reasons, or a diet that's not particularly great. And of course, especially having a history of smoking, we think, and upper respiratory problems, those really set you off in bad shape for being a potential COVID-19 victim. That's exactly right. Other questions or remarks here? Great big huge health disparities. And you know, that's not new, but although I feel like I mentioned it earlier in C175, you know, it's not necessarily something that you would always see discussed or as part of, you know, course material outside of like a health econ course or a course in the public health department or something like that. Here's another way of visualizing it, and I regret that, you know, each picture I show you is of a sort of a different concept. This is a distribution of the age at death by income group. So the solid line is the distribution for people in the upper 80% of income measured in roughly 1981. So this is a longitudinal study taking a snapshot of your income in 1981, and then it's a period measure here too, I think, rather than following the people over time and watching them die. But you would still see the same basic pattern. The people in the upper 80% of income have a more tightly distributed, so higher peaked distribution here. There's less variance. You know, you have more certainty about when you're going to die. Still, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty still. The standard deviation is still 14 years here in this dark line. But it's worse if you're in the lowest 20%. And of course, you know, everybody would say, well, obviously, of course, it's going to be worse if you have less income. Everything's worse when you have less income. That's true. You've got a lower average length of life starting from age 10. That's what this thing is. M10 is 71.9 years, and you've got 77.4 years average for the upper 80 percentile. And a lot of that is, of course, the shape of this. This is all-cause mortality, so you would be right to say that, well, a decent part is external cause mortality, like homicide and suicide, getting shot and killed by the police, getting shot and killed by a domestic partner, heaven forbid, you know, all those sorts of things. That's true, and those sorts of things do impact people of low income and also of disadvantaged backgrounds more often. That's definitely true. In this study that's hyperlinked here, though, we took out external cause mortality, which is the obvious one, and you still see things like this even after you do that. And you see something similar if you look at educational groups. So here we don't have college graduates. I kind of wish we had done that, but you know, you can't do everything. And so we looked at high school and less than high school, and there's a pretty big difference there. It would also be the case, and this is part of what Lab 13 steps you through, that if you looked at the college graduates, say, for example, your cohort, you probably would see something very similar, that college graduates compared to non-college graduates would get you the same sort of dynamic. There's a longer average length of life and also less variation around that average. The higher SES you have, the higher socioeconomic status, the higher education, the more income that you have. And of course, the million-dollar question is what exactly is causing all of this? Here's a really good question. What does the density mean on the left-hand side axis? The density is it's the probability density. So I think the way to read this would be that if there's like a 2% chance of dying at age 70 on the nose. It's really more meaningful when you sum the densities over a bunch of ages and you get some story about how the total sum of densities, say, of reaching age 70. Whatever sum you might see there under the curve is the cumulative probability of dying before you pass age 70, for example. That's the way of reading it. You could also abstract and just think about this as a histogram, which could be a frequency count or whatever it is, but it's a probability. That's the way we typically think about this, but it could also be some something like, take a cohort of 1,000 people, I guess 100 in this case, and you would see, 1.5 of them dying in this particular age, something kind of like that. Okay, so the big question is, why, right? Why are there such big health inequalities? And of course, you could dive into the weeds and talk about COVID-19, in particular, and that would be useful. And I'm sure there's going to be tons of research on this sort of thing. And there ought to be, because, there are going to be communities heavily impacted, and policies need to be developed to, assess those and help those specific communities for sure. I think it's early, I think, to figure out, which are in fact the greatest hit, because, the first line in the medical sector, I think, have the greatest risk. But I also think, people in delivery services and grocery stores, maybe gas stations, anything that's open and being visited by large amounts of the public, I think are also at risk. And also, goodness, another one is like prison populations, right? Some of whom are being released to try to keep them from catching it. So what we're going to do is pivot and talk generally about, what's underneath all this, because this seems to matter. This stuff is probably why we have seen, what's a good story here, this kind of thing, that the death rates, and again, I need to think about how to show this again, since these are different scales and everything, but to me, I think it's still important that, there's a more gentle upward slope of the mortality curve here for COVID-19, and it starts earlier. The age shape of mortality is important, and it gets you a story that looks like this, ultimately. The people who are on the low end of the totem pole, they are the ones who have mortality that starts earlier and is more gently sloped as it goes. The people who are lucky are the ones for whom there's a long delay, and then finally this rising force of mortality, which of course is never fun when it comes, but it's a lot better than kicking off too early, for sure. I think that's the funniest thing, is that we're all keenly aware that this is happening. I think some of us much more than others, and bless fate, I have personally not been touched by this, or my family, yet, and I hope that we will not be, and I hope that none of your families and none of you will be personally touched by this as well. But it makes us all think a little bit about everything, about the value of having our parents and grandparents around, and how much we love them, and how much we want them to be careful, and how much we don't want them to go yet, and they probably don't either. And I think that's, of course, a very fundamental human thing. Then I also think about my grandmother, whom I mentioned turned 100 during the class back in, I think it's March. I have to look at my calendar to see when her birthday is. She turned 100 and she has dementia. And, I think she enjoys her life. I think things are hard. And I've heard it said more than a few times that there might be something not so perfect about living a super, super long time because of the dementia. Of course, that's what it comes down to, right? It's the quality of life. And even at middle age, I can tell you that the quality of your life does deteriorate a little bit as you get older. It's not as if you're just young and vigorous forever until you just drop dead, at age 90, having lived this amazing life of being an Olympian or something. It's kind of like a gentle slope into oblivion. At least up until age 46, I feel like I'm gently sloping into oblivion. So it raises these questions, of course, about, well, what to do when, and what, it's clear that premature mortality just really stinks. It's also clear that premature mortality of a younger person is such a ridiculous tragedy, and premature mortality of somebody who's 100 is not great. I think that's kind of one way to put it. And yeah, it's hard to escape thinking about all those sorts of things. I think when one looks at this story of the high and low education, of the black and white difference, this is very, I think, just transfixing to me. This is just absolutely a tragedy. Mortality rates that are so accelerated at younger ages. Mortality rates that are accelerated at older ages, I think I'm a little bit less concerned about that. But it's the big story here is health inequalities that are large, that impact people with a lot of life otherwise left to be lived. And I think that's kind of the way that we view this. How is dying at 100 premature? Well, that's right, but it might be accelerated compared to the baseline. That's a good question, though. It depends on what your counterfactual is. And I think my point there was to say that the thing is that, you know, she's got dementia at age 100. Every life is precious, but lives are different, and they are different over the life cycle. I think that's the thing that I probably is fairly obvious to people, I guess. But what are the implications of that? I'm not sure, but it's something that we ought to keep in mind. And so, and I think what I want to say is that it makes this discussion of the health inequalities affecting people with low education, with low income, with disadvantaged backgrounds. So it's in the United States, it's the story about being African-American primarily. It turns out that Hispanics also face disadvantages, but they actually, at least in mortality terms, appear to be better off on average, even than non-Hispanic whites, which is, you know, maybe a nice silver lining, but it reflects selection and other things. A big part of the story is the historically disadvantaged African-American communities that have extremely low life expectancy and variable life expectancy relative to probably what they ought to have. And that's what we would call a health disparity, something that we don't believe that we should be seeing. And the question is why. You also see this, though, it's not just African-Americans, it's also people of low education. And next week, we'll talk about Angus Deaton's excellent contribution to our knowledge and the zeitgeist, focusing on deaths of despair, which primarily seem to be afflicting non-Hispanic whites at middle age. So me, not quite me. It's usually non-Hispanic whites with less than a high school degree, or like a high school degree and no more, that kind of thing. And that's the group that they were just instrumental in finding this pattern. Famous, and we'll talk about it next week. So I should just stop myself there. So, okay, what causes what? Does low SES cause bad health? Does the reverse happen, or are there other variables? This is important because, you know, we do have policies in place to try to raise people's socioeconomic status. Now you can say, of course, that it's not obvious all of them work. The tax code technically tries to do this to some extent. Public education tries to do this. You might say, well, it doesn't do enough, and that's a reasonable point. And of course, that was one of the planks of, you know, Bernie Sanders and others to try to make higher education publicly available, just like K through 12 education is. And so this is worth talking about. Well, what would the effect be? It depends on your view about the relative strengths of these little arrows, which is kind of like a DAG, right? A dynamic directed acyclical graph, I think is what it's called, DAG. You're big among epidemiologists, and I'm never too sure about what they really say. All right, so this is in the Bhattacharya reading in chapter 4, and there's also a chapter 3 that we're going to start on and get through some amount of first. There are a bunch of different theories about this, and I think the challenge is here to be able to pick through these and you know, put more words, associate more words with them to make them clearer. So the first one is, I think, called in the text like the efficient producer hypothesis. And what it says is that it appears people with more education are more easily able to spend their time in healthy pursuits. Understanding medical advice is a big one. Following directions, having the time to be able to take your medication, to set up systems to remind yourself to do it, and, you know, with each unit of time actually having a larger impact on your health. What exactly that reflects is not entirely clear. It could be privilege. It could be the ability to finish something. So we could get deep into the weeds about this, but, you know, one of the reasons why your college degree is going to be worth so much is because you will have demonstrated that you have the ability to finish something, especially if you're graduating. God bless you if you're graduating in 2020 and everybody thereafter, but you have demonstrated the ability to stick through it, through this amazingly tumultuous period. And you might also say, well, okay, Professor Evers, COVID-19 is pretty insane, but let me tell you, there's a lot of other stuff I've had to get through. And I would agree. And of course, some students have much more to get through than others do, much more than I ever knew as a student. There are all kinds of things that you have to get through in order to finish the degree. And that might be part of the reason why the degree is so valuable. It's a revelation of the ability that you have to get through something. And so that's underneath part of this as well. But part of it could be a treatment effect of more education, being exposed to all these different ideas that make you think about the world in different ways and make you reevaluate your choices and your thought processes. You know, that's all possible. And I think it would be silly to imagine that education has no impact ever. I think what questions is, when, right? I would just imagine kindergarten is a big one. The thrifty phenotype, also childhood deprivation. And so you could get sciencey about it, and we will. You could also say that it matters if you grow up poor. It matters also, it turns out, if you were in the womb and your mother was poor and bad things were happening when you were in utero. That's also true. We'll talk about the direct income hypothesis. We'll talk about this allostatic load, which sounds like something out of college physics or shop class or something, where you're running electricity current, electrical current through something, and income inequality, and those are kind of related things. Stress is another sort of synonym for allostatic load. We'll talk about access to healthcare, and then how health can enhance productive time and income. So that's the reverse causality argument there. And finally, a big one, what's it called? The Fuchs hypothesis. Victor Fuchs is how you pronounce that name, F-U-C-H-S. We'll let the jokes ensue there, but he's a wonderful guy. I think he's in his 90s now, or if he's not, he might be in his late 80s, I think. He's up there in years. He's down at Stanford. So we won't hold that against him, though. And his contribution was to point out the time preference is probably important. And of course, where that comes from exactly is a little bit less clear, but some of it's probably nature and some of it's probably nurture in your early years, and maybe some of it's learned also in college even, perhaps. All right, so before we do that, though, we're going to talk about the Grossman model, and we won't have time to finish it. We might, I don't know. I wanted to make this pitch that, the Grossman model is important to see. And at the same time, the Grossman model is not as transparent as the other workhorse models of 175. And so it's not going to be on the final exam. If I change my mind about that, I'll let you know. I don't think it will be, because it's just not as transparently useful. But it does make these valuable points to begin from and to think about what then you see unfolding. I think the temptation is to view this as a model of, everything's an endogenous choice, and don't we believe that people make the best choices all the time? And therefore, we're in this libertarian world of, let health inequalities be what they are. And I think that would be a mistake. A big one is that, if health is like a stock of capital, that's kind of the punchline here. And that's a reasonable way of thinking about it. But to begin with, well, what's the stock you're endowed with? And that comes with you out of your mother's womb, or, if you're in the Matrix, I guess you could, born in a little vat or something, but you come out of the womb with this health capital. It depends on the health and the well-being and the socioeconomic status of your mother primarily, and also of the community in which she is, and your family and all that. And then it depreciates, and the depreciation rate depends a little bit on the environment. It also depends on your behavior, and then you can make investments into your health. So it's not as if we're closing off all these other channels and saying that, well, everything's perfect because you could choose everything. That's not what we're saying. But what we are saying is that there's an economic part of the decision-making process that goes into this: how much time you spend doing healthy pursuits, like going to the doctor, following your doctor's advice, not smoking, even though smoking's really fun. It really is, but don't do it. Don't smoke. Seriously, don't smoke. Smoking, of course, as we've talked about, is this marker of COVID-19, exposure to COVID-19, right? So even though smoking's fun, you shouldn't do it. And it takes self-control not to. It also, of course, takes having a peer group in which not everybody's smoking to avoid smoking. Similar thing with drinking. Okay, so that's the point, is that there's a stock of health. People think about stuff. I want just to give a shout out to to Michael Grossman, who's just been fantastic to me. He's been fantastic to just I don't know, probably 1,000 health economists and other people in his life as a mentor and guide. So he's still on faculty. He's emeritus now at the City University of New York as of like 2017, I think. He was a PhD student at Columbia with Gary Becker. So the same Gary Becker we talked about in the Becker model. And of course, Gary Becker was this amazing thinker. It's crazy to think about folks who are just amazing and have have touched so many other bright brains in their lives and helped them. And so the joke here was that, Mike told me once that he helped Gary Becker type up a textbook manuscript. It was never widely used, and the price that he got per hour, the wage was like 3 cents or something because of how much work went into it. Michael Grossman also worked for Victor Fuchs, which I mentioned a slide or two ago, who's down at Stanford, and that was at the NBER offices there that had originally been elsewhere in Manhattan. So the point of this then is to focus on behaviors and the usefulness of looking at it that way, and those are there. Social determinants are also there. The Grossman model has a ton of different moving parts, and so if this is going to be useful to you, by all means dive in, and if this is not useful to you, by all means ignore it. This part of the course I want to focus on the big punchlines and the big pictures, which I don't think necessarily the graphs and the standard tools of economics really always help us a ton in understanding. The one that I think is useful to look at is the downward sloping demand for health capital thing. And that's up here at the upper right. There also, though, you'll notice here's a labor leisure graph, which is a lot like what we've looked at earlier in the course. And you could imagine, prices of things shifting with substitution and income effects and all that. That's all there. It's not anything I really want to spend a lot of time on, though, but I did want to just briefly talk about the underpinnings of this. To be honest, in large part, it's because you probably will see things like this again, especially if you go into finance. It's a model that looks a lot like models that you might see for physical capital accumulation, for any sort of investment into an asset that requires some costs of diverted funds. So health is a stock. If utility then has this kind of structure where you're maximizing your discounted lifetime utility. So that's what this delta thing does. The delta discounts these future time periods. So here's time 0, here's time 1, that's say a year in the future. And your health stock enters your utility. It's something that you have to enjoy, to do stuff, obviously. And the point is that you have to invest in it, which I think we'll see this in the next slide about this. It turns out it's going to be kind of like a differential equation if you get into the weeds about it with the health stock. The point is then, that we've got some sort of lifetime discounted utility that you're maximizing, and that looks a lot like, say, a profit maximization with a future stream of benefits from a capital good. It's the same concept here. And of course, this was the 1960s and 1970s, where I think advancing a view like that, first of all, was novel, and also didn't get you immediately laughed out of the building. I mean, it's figurative, and so you get a metaphor that is useful. It's also not the whole story. Some of the key things, though, are that there's a depreciation rate of health capital. So here's your health at time t, which is some function h of a bunch of things, including last period's health. Health h sub t minus 1 is what you sort of inherit into this period. And the thing is that some of it breaks. Some of your body breaks down, which, I mean, here's the thing. It's like, this can happen in your youth and your ages at which you guys are at. It definitely happens starting at my age, I think, and it most certainly happens in old age, that you see a higher rate of depreciation, whether it's your psychological or mental acuity, or in many cases the physical functioning of your bodily organs and your joints and all that. What you can do, though, is use your time to spend on healthy pursuits. So you could think of this as being exercise. You could also purchase market inputs like checkups and prescription pills and all that. So that's all underneath all this. I'm going to just wave my magic wand and say what you end up seeing then is a graph that looks a lot like what we've seen before. Here's if you like, a price along the vertical axis. It's actually a rate of return that you draw from health capital. here's a quantity along the horizontal axis. It's the amount of health capital. And this is a downward sloping thing that seems a lot like a demand curve. And it's the same basic idea of the diminishing marginal productivity. You'll see the very same thing if you go on to study economics in graduate school. If you look at models of physical capital investments, it's the same sort of thing. So I know I'm going fast, but we'll make sure to highlight the salient things. And I do want to make sure that we get set up next time to talk about some of the causal mechanisms here that we think are important in understanding health inequalities. All right. So why are we doing any of this? Well, you can't do everything. You can't do everything. Right? That's economics in a nutshell. You can't do everything. So you've got to figure out what to do. And it's a good idea to think about the marginal benefits and marginal costs of doing anything in particular. So there are obvious marginal benefits to investing in your health. You have more health, you get to live longer. But part of it, though, you might find is that there are diminishing returns to spending time investing in your health. In and of themselves, right? So one of the problems is going to be that you don't only have so much time in the day. And so the time that you spend investing in your health is time taken away from working or from just relaxing. That's definitely true. But even if you spend all the time in your day on your health, you would find diminishing returns. And that's in the earlier slide there, of course, which is part of it. There's just generally, though, an opportunity cost. Leaving that aside, if time spent being healthy or doing healthy things is different than time spent doing other things. And so it turns out what that's going to reflect or show up here as is I know it's going to sound funny, but it's a rate of return. And you can think about this as being like the capital interest rate. The rate of return of taking your cash and putting it into the financial markets, that would be little r. That's something else you could effectively do here and we're thinking about it as being money metric, right? So you could think about this as a story about your time, but of course your time is valuable. You can translate your time into cash with your wage. And then you're investing in health capital. What's an equivalent concept? It would be investing in some other kind of capital. And so here's then that link to that. The most important part of this is not the weirdness of how there's the financial market interest rate here, little r. It's how it's how this sort of horizontal, if you like, supply curve, if you like a supply of funds or something like that, also includes this depreciation due to aging factor. And the point there is that you've got to get a return on your health at least equal to r plus this health depreciation term. Because the health depreciation is what you're stuck with. If the return is less than R plus gamma, I called it Y a second ago. It's supposed to be a gamma, just for kicks. If the return is less than that, then market returns beat out your health investment return. You should go play the markets instead. Okay. Again, it's a metaphor, right? Because the health inequalities that we're interested in many cases apply in describing these subpopulations where we doubt there's actually a lot of investment in financial markets, right? Think about poor, less educated people. They probably don't have a lot of cash on hand. They probably don't own anything except maybe a family house or something like that. What this is a metaphor about, though, is how there are other things you can spend your time doing. You can be working. You could be raising children, right? That's a big thing earlier. And you could also be investing in your health. So if the returns to investing in your health are low, you're going to spend your time doing other things. So we are approaching the end, and maybe I'll just go ahead and pause there and answer this question that just came through on the chat. So next time we'll kind of finish. Okay, I'll just have a word to say next time about this slide, and then we'll actually get onto the story about health disparities and some of the theories there. Okay, and so Nicole's question in the chat is useful for everybody to hear about review sessions or office hours during RRR week. So I think what I'd like to do there, because just based on what has been happening in class, is I think I'd like to field questions in advance and then record some answers, or at least have the questions fielded to me first. And then, I could work up some answers, and then we could have a live discussion of them, for example. Maybe that would be better. So, oh, and here's another question: is there a practice file? So let me maybe field a survey about that, because I'm concerned about running a live review session. And I'm also concerned about instead just having lots of office hours, because I think students are going to have similar questions. So what I'd really like to do is, have some office hours, but I'd like to ask students to submit some questions beforehand, and then, collect them, have some responses, and then maybe do a live video. You should open a Google form for questions in the chat, and you can address them in a review session. Yeah, I would like to do that. Then you can ask follow-up questions live. I think that's a good idea, because I just think it would be hard for students to communicate it easily. It's just, this is hard, to do this over Zoom. And so I think that would be a good idea. Thank you, Justin. And then Nicole's question, is there a practice final? There can be. The part of the problem is that the format is going to be so different, but the topical coverage will be similar. So we'll try to get you guys a practice final to look at and be thinking about. Okay, and we're out of time, but are there any other questions? Thank you, you're welcome, and thank you. I'm not sure which one to say. Thanks and everything. Thanks. It's been a long week. Other questions? Thank you. Okay, looks like folks are cool. Thanks. Have a great weekend. See you next week.